Alright, we're back, of course, talking Final Fantasy VII. We're talking Rebirth and kind of Part 3 as well, because, of course, we're always talking about Part 3. We're talking about DLC. In my personal opinion, I feel like there kind of needs to be some DLC for Rebirth. Now, the topic of DLC for Rebirth has existed pretty much since 2021, when we got episode intermission for Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade. I think it's kind of a fair expectation. It'd be kind of weird to get through the entire Remake trilogy and there not be any other kind of, like, expansions or DLCs. There's just like this one, couple hour piece for the first game, and that was it. We have had a little bit in the past about the conversation of DLC for Rebirth, and the devs pretty much saying that there's like no plans for it. I don't think they've ever outright said no. Like 100% no chance there's ever going to be DLC for Rebirth. It's more so just them saying there's no plans for that. For example, right here's this tweet from Shinra Arc that says, FF7 Rebirth creative director Nomura has confirmed that the team is not planning any DLC for the second entry of the remake series. That tweet was from 2022, but it kind of like blew up last year. We did a video about it in September of 2023. I guess people were just kind of having the conversation about the potential of DLC, and maybe that tweet started making the rounds again. I don't entirely remember. As far as I'm aware, that's like the most recent bit we've had on the conversation of DLC from the devs for Rebirth. And again, that was from 2022. We covered it last year, but it's like 2 years old at this point. I don't think I've ever kind of like talked about it again, unless I've missed out on it. If I somehow discussed it on my channel, I didn't put it in like the title, because that September 2023 video is the most recent DLC video I have on my channel, which I wouldn't have done that. Like, if there's talk of DLC in any way, positive or negative, it 100% be in the title for sure. The point of bringing all this up is that the last we heard from Nomura was there's no plans for DLC for Rebirth, which fucking means nothing. Like, devs saying that means absolutely nothing. We've heard this in the past with like Naoki Yoshida and Final Fantasy 16, right? It's an example I use a lot, where prior to the release of 16, he kept talking about there not being plans for DLC. And then obviously the game got 2 pieces of DLC. In fact, they got this first piece of DLC like half a year after release. Let's be completely honest here. That's just like kind of straight up lying, right? You don't have 2 pieces of DLC for your single player game in the chamber, one dropping like 6-7 months after release, another one dropping less than a year from release. Yoshida claimed it was like fan feedback and they made DLC for it because the fans were happy. It's like, dude, you'd be creating from the ground up a piece of DLC with like characters and story and lore and areas to explore, monsters to fight, intricate boss fights. You just came up with that in like a couple months? Like, nah, come on. Obviously, this is a completely different studio. It's still Square Enix. It's still Final Fantasy, but it's just an example I wanted to show that like the discussion of no plans for DLC doesn't really matter. Like, in my opinion, I don't think you want to really talk about DLC prior to a game coming out, especially for like a single player game, because then it just feels like you're taking content out of the main game and turn it into DLC, or you're taking like cut content from the main game and then you're finishing that and making it into a piece of DLC for the game, something along those lines. That's obviously very dependent on the game itself and any particular DLC for it, what that is. Like, for example, with like the Remake DLC, episode intermission, that doesn't feel like something that was ever going to be a part of Remake itself, right? That definitely feels very absent of the Remake story. There never would have been an opportune moment to cut away from the Remake story and follow Yuffie's journey for like 2 or 3 hours. This kind of has a bad look, right? Because prior to the game even releasing, I haven't even given you my $70 for the game yet, and you're already talking about additional things you want me to spend money on. Don't get me wrong, I'm totally down to buy some DLC for the Remake project. I'm hopeful for there to be DLC for Rebirth. I was excited for there to be DLC for Remake, right? And it's something you need to talk about it like prior to the release, especially like a year and a half, 2 years before the game even comes out. That looks pretty weird if they're like, oh yeah, we totally have DLC planned for Remake Part 2. Like, that'd be just strange, right? And as we kind of always talked about on the channel, at least a few times on the channel, Vincent's like the best candidate for a piece of DLC for Rebirth, bridging the gap between, Rebirth and Remake Part 3, giving us some sort of like backstory on the character of Vincent, right? Because there's plenty of backstory there. You could also do like a Cid DLC. The thing is, we're definitely going to go to Rocket Town at some point in the third game, and that's where you're going to get the story for Cid, the backstory for Cid. When it comes to Remake Part 3, I don't know where you fit in the Vincent backstory. Like, when it comes to the character of Vincent, there's just so much backstory with his ties to the Shinra Company, to the Turks, to Sephiroth, the main fucking villain of the game, Hojo, Lucrezia, who is of course Sephiroth's birth mother, the Protomateria, Chaos, Omega, and probably some other shit that I'm not remembering off the top of my head right now. I just don't know where they find a moment to really give Vincent enough time to like develop as a character in the third game, considering we still have to do the rest of the FF7 story, right? All of Disc 2 and what little bit there is on Disc 3. And Disc 2 is packed. There's a lot of goddamn shit that they're going to be doing, right? There's a lot we still have to cover. And they're also going to incorporate, Wutai into the game at some point, give it an actual story purpose. We have to travel to Wutai for, I guess, like Yuffie's, story or whatever. So it's like, I don't know when and where you do that, right? And really when it came to the original Final Fantasy VII, even there, Vincent kind of got the short end of the stick, right? Because both him and Yuffie are optional characters, but Yuffie gets quite a bit more. I mean, Wutai is an entirely optional location, but that still is a Yuffie location where you can get some backstory and some story for her. And of course, you have the Don Corneo like side content, side quest sort of stuff. Vincent's story is relegated to Lucrezia Cave, where you get this flashback that kind of shows the history of the character. Obviously, there'll be like little bits of dialogue throughout the FF7 story, especially if Vincent's like in your party. You'll get some stuff there, right? You know, when you first meet Vincent, he kind of talks about Sephiroth a bit, whatever, right? But generally speaking, like what you get for Vincent is Lucrezia Cave. I just always thought my guy needed some more, right? He got a little bit disrespected, I would say, in the original FF7 compared to the other optional character. And also, Yuffie got DLC for the remake project. You know, she's one of the optional characters in the original FF7. I think it makes a bit of sense. Maybe the other optional character would get some DLC to kind of flesh out their backstory. As I kind of alluded to at the beginning of the video, I think you kind of need it because, like, I know these days, like, the FF7 characters are popular, but, like, we're just put ourselves in the shoes of people that don't know Final Fantasy VII. Like, who the hell is Vincent, right? I kind of need some backstory on that character. Just to kind of, like, further explain who he is, because, like, why the fuck does he turn into a gigantic monster in the Shinra mansion? Why are we fighting a monster man in the basement? What's happening? I just kind of always thought it'd be cool to, like, play the backstory for Vincent. I don't know if you play as, like, Turk Vincent in Dirge of Cerberus. I know there's, like, you know, cutscenes of him where he's in the Turk outfit before he's, like, the badass that we know him as today. But I think it'd be kind of cool if you could, like, play as Turk Vincent and kind of lead up to the events of, like, the birth of Sephiroth and the proto-materia and all that other shit with Vincent. Kind of set the ground for maybe his bigger role in the third game. Which I do hope he has, because he's, like, kind of, like, the strongest character in the party. Obviously, Cloud's the main character, but, like, the proto-materia and the Chaos form, I don't know if we're going to get Chaos in this game, just because, like, Dirge of Cerberus made it where it's, like, this end-of-the-world scenario sort of thing when he turns into Chaos. He was just... Chaos in the original FF7 was just a form he could take, right? So when it comes to Dirge of Cerberus, you just play as, like, Vincent, and I think the Gallian Beast, and I think at the very end of the game is when you turn into Chaos, if I'm not mistaken, right? It's not just this form that he can take, like, anytime he wants to, essentially. Right? Which I think makes sense, given the lore they gave to the Proto-Materia, and the Chaos form, and the character of Vincent, and Omega Weapon, and stuff like that. Like, he shouldn't just be turned into Chaos whenever the hell he wants to. That's fine. But I do hope that we get to at least see Chaos, maybe at the end of the third game or something like that. Maybe turns into it to help fight fucking Sephiroth or something. I don't know. Or fight some of the weapons. I don't know. And since we're talking about Vincent's other forms, like, I do hope we get, you know, Hellmasker and Death Gigas. If they want to do, like, other forms, I guess that's fine. But they're just kind of iconic to me just because of the original FF7. I just hope we don't have, like, just Gallian Beast through all of the third game and then maybe, like, Chaos at the end. Like, that'd be kind of boring to me. The main argument that I expect to see against a DLC for Vincent or just a DLC in general for Rebirth is it taken away from the development for the third game, right? We know that it's supposed to be roughly about 3 years. We were told by the devs it's going to take a similar period of time that it took from Remake to Rebirth, excluding the Yuffie DLC, which took about a year, right? So 2021 to 2024, which is a fair argument. I totally understand that. I will say if they were already planning on doing some sort of DLC for Rebirth, it would have already been in some level of development prior to the release of the game. And at this point, we're already more than 8 months from release. And it only took them like a year or so to make the Yuffie DLC. So, like, it would be, you know, probably fairly close to being done if they were going to do a PC DLC. I don't really know how much it, like, affect the development of the third game. Plus, like, the Yuffie DLC was them, like, first attempting to make shit for the PS5, whereas they're a lot more familiar now. So it wouldn't be as long to make the DLC. Something else kind of against, like, a Vincent backstory DLC, or maybe just a DLC in general, is gameplay. Like, if it's a backstory DLC, like, what do you do? Because the Vincent we're going to be having in the third game... it's fucking magical and turns into monsters and flies around and whatever, right? Like, who knows exactly how his gameplay is going to be, right? He turns into a goddamn Gallian Beast. What do you do with a backstory DLC as just Vincent as a Turk? I mean, he can still have a gun and maybe fight similar to how he's going to fight in the third game, but what do you really do? Totally, I don't know. Kind of the main argument against a Vincent DLC for Rebirth, for me at least, is that it would ruin the anticipation for the third game. We're looking forward to the new characters, Vincent and Cid, right? If we had DLC where we get to fight and control Vincent that maybe fights at least similar to how he's going to fight in the third game, it kind of ruined that anticipation, if that makes any sense, right? Same thing for Cid, too. If you want to throw out the possibility of, like, a Cid-related DLC, it'd be the same thing, right? If we're already getting DLC where we get to fight and control Cid, we still can look forward to those characters in the third game, but we'd already know how they're going to fight and how to use them. Came to the Yuffie DLC, that's happening parallel to the remake story, right? During the events of the first game, it's already modern-day Yuffie. She's already a badass. She can fight, you know, all that's already established. So maybe you put aside, like, the backstory idea for a DLC for Vincent, and maybe it's something that happens modern-day, where he's the Vincent we know now. Because what we know with Rebirth is that it at least seems like Vincent wasn't actually sleeping for, like, 20 years or whatever, like it was with the original continuity. There's lights on and books out and about in this, like, chamber where he's in the coffin. Also, we know he's like a security guard of sorts for the Shinra Mansion, so it means he, like, wakes up every so often to maybe deal with intruders or monsters or something. You can maybe do, like, a DLC that's, like, modern day, maybe it picks up, like, right before our group finds Vincent, maybe you get some story there, some lore there. But also, as we're traveling around the world once Vincent joins the party, he's kind of off doing his own shit a lot of times. When you get to, like, a new location, like, Vincent will be over here by himself, like, isolated, for whatever reason. That's just kind of like his character, I guess. But also, like, when we get to Forgotten Capital, like, he's already there, right? He's already, like, ahead of the group over here doing his own shit. He's also there for, like, the Temple of the Ancients and shit like that, right? He helps out throughout the story, just different random moments, right? So I think it'd be kind of cool if you could do maybe a DLC that's taking place kind of similar to the Yuffie DLC, kind of parallel to Rebirth. Maybe we just have, like, a piece of DLC that's, like, following Vincent, maybe even Vincent and Sid, because they're both probably hanging back a lot of the time, you know, with, like, the Tiny Bronco and shit. Kind of what they were doing during the events of Rebirth. Something that I think is kind of, like, heavily in favor of there potentially being DLC for Rebirth is that we've had new FF7 shit every year for the last, like, several years. If you want to include the marketing for Remake, it started in 2019. If you just want to look from the release of Remake till now, it's been since 2020. But we also had Remake in 2020. 2021 was kind of big because we had, like, Episode Intermission and Intergrade. Also the release of First Soldier. Also the release of Remake onto Epic. 2022 had the release of Remake onto Steam, of course. But also we had, like, Crisis Core Reunion drop that year. Actually, 2022 had, like, kind of the start of a little bit of the marketing for Rebirth, because we got that little teaser trailer of, like, Zack taking Cloud to Midgar, and obviously the reveal that it's called Rebirth and that it is confirmed to be a trilogy. 2023 was the marketing for Rebirth, but also the release of Ever Crisis. Then, of course, this year we have the release of Rebirth. So the question then becomes, what are we going to have next year? We do have the release of Rebirth on the PC on the horizon, probably next year at some points. But there also has been, like, a new piece of media every single year, right? Again, Remake in 2020, Episode Intermission in 2021, also the release of First Soldier. 2022's Crisis Core Reunion, which I would qualify as, like, a new piece of media, right? It's like a remake/remaster of a game that was stuck on the PSP for, like, ever. And, of course, last year's, like, Ever Crisis. This year's Rebirth. What is next year? Inevitably, that trend will break, right? It's not going to be a new piece of FF7 media every single year till the end of time. Would I love that? Abso-fucking-lutely. But I wouldn't expect that trend to break until maybe after the third game comes out. But even then, the third game itself could also have DLC for all we know. It's also very possible that Ever Crisis is meant to be that thing, right? To kind of fill the gap between the releases of, you know, FF7 stuff. Like, you have that. It's always there. You can always play. There's always new content, always new updates, new characters, all that other shit. Maybe that's, like, kind of the purpose of Ever Crisis, at least during the Remake trilogy's development, to kind of hold you over while you wait for the third game. Other possibilities for other FF7 shit, you know, kind of in the near future or whatever. I mean, there's the long rumored, like, FF7 animated series or whatever it was on, like, Netflix. Now, that was just, like, a 4chan thing a long time ago. I don't know that there was, like, ever any credibility to it. But we always got to throw it in there when we talk about, you know, potential FF7 projects. There's also, whatever that quote was from, like, Katase or Nomura. I can't remember the verbatim what it was. It's been, like, a year, 2 years ago at this point. We talked about, like, multiple projects besides the FF7 Remake trilogy. And the only ever one we got out of that, if I'm not mistaken, that we didn't know about at the time was Crisis Core Reunion, right? There's never been, like, another project. We already knew about Ever Crisis. We already knew about First Soldier. Those are things that were already known about, right? So I don't know if there's ever going to be something that comes from that. It hasn't happened at this point, but maybe there's some other FF7 stuff that we just don't know about. I don't know. Anyways, kind of tangent there. The point of the video isn't to, like, say that there's for sure going to be DLC for Rebirth. I think there's, like, decent odds that there could be. I just personally think that there kind of needs to be to flesh out, like, particular characters like Vincent. Because I just don't know where at in the story they would do that. I mean, like a dedicated section to Vincent, something that's, like, you know, an hour plus long for that particular character, something like the Yuffie DLC itself, which is longer than that, but also the Wutai segment coming up. You have, like, you know, Corel for Barrett, Cosmic Canyon for Red 13. You have Rocket Town upcoming for, you know, Sid. It's like, I don't know exactly where in the FF7 story they would do that for Vincent necessarily, and I think that's why a DLC is a pretty good option. But of course, that's where I pass off to you guys. Those are my thoughts. What are your thoughts on a potential DLC for Rebirth? What do you think it would be? Do you think Vincent's a pretty good candidate? If you don't want a DLC for Rebirth because it might interfere with the development period for the third game, where do you think they're going to put, like, the Vincent lore, I guess, into the third game? Like, where's, like, the opportune moment or location? That's the video. Subscribe to the channel if you guys are new. Just in the description below. Follow me on Twitter, _davidYT. That's it. Bye.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect, we spend it with no shame, we blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Rogaine, or leave it like Cobain.